Today we're going to continue our series in which we're looking at different teachings of Jesus. We're not even going to look at everything, of course. It's not long enough of a season, but we're looking at teachings here and there in Jesus' life and ministry, and we're looking at them from a different angle. And what we're coming to see is that Jesus, while he was concerned about life after death, he spent the bulk of his time talking about how we live life right now. And he was interested in teaching people about not only the implications for what they believe in God, but also the implications for their daily living. And sometimes his teachings even had political implications for the world they lived in. So today we're looking at Jesus' teaching on violence. The idea of violence as a solution to our problems. Now, first of all, we need to remember that Jesus' teachings are not given to us in a vacuum. It's not as though he is removed from culture. Jesus is a part of the culture of the first century. The people that he is speaking to are an oppressed people group. They are oppressed by Rome. They have been under foreign rule for centuries. Meanwhile, their Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, had been promising them that they would be this great nation, that they would be ruling like they did in the days of King David. And so it's like the scriptures are almost adding insult to injury, because here they are. They're not living the way the Bible says that they would, and it's been hundreds of years. So they're really wondering what's going on. And they're expecting somebody to come and help them. They're expecting a Messiah. But a Messiah is not what we think it is. So usually when we hear the word Messiah, we think of a religious term specifically. In fact, we usually think of Jesus. And when we say Jesus Christ, sometimes we say that as though Christ is Jesus' last name. Christ is actually a title. It's a political title that refers to power, having rulership. In the Old Testament days, I should backtrack 1 minute and say that Christ is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah. And in the Old Testament days, all of the kings of Israel, all of the kings of Judah were called Messiahs. That meant that they were chosen, they were set apart, they were anointed with oil on their head and set apart for their task of ruling. And so Christ itself is a political title given to Jesus. And it also, of course, has spiritual meaning too, but in their day it was primarily political. And then also the term Son of God, as we think about, I want to remind you that many of the Roman emperors were called Son of God. In fact, we learned in our Lent Bible study this week that Caesar Augustus was actually called Son of God, and that's because his dad, after he died, he was made into a god, and so he was literally a son of God. And so these titles, when they are applied to Jesus, they are just dripping with religious and political meaning all at the same time. But when people are expecting a Messiah, what they're basically expecting is they're expecting a powerful person, not necessarily divine, but they're expecting a powerful person to come who is going to rule, and they are going to be so close in their relationship to God that they could be considered like a son. And they are going to fight against their Roman oppressors and lead them to freedom. You know, they have a good example of this in the Old Testament, of course. They also have the Maccabean revolt from their Jewish history. In between the Old and New Testaments, there's a story about this family, Jewish family called the Maccabees, that led this violent revolt against the people who were oppressing them. And they actually won. And they gained political independence for a period of time. You know the Jewish holiday Hanukkah? That celebrates this victory. Well, many people would have had this in mind. And so you can imagine when the disciples and other people start identifying Jesus as the Messiah, first he says, you're right, but don't tell anyone. It's because with all of this baggage around that title, he knows that the moment that people know, especially Rome or some of the religious leaders, they are going to come at him and he's not going to have much time left. And so that's why he wants to keep it a secret for a while. So given this background, he's teaching on nonviolence. He says, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, and then he continues on, he says, to turn the other cheek, to go the extra mile, to love your enemies. You know, you've heard it said, love your neighbor, hate your enemies, but I tell you, love your enemies. Pray for those who curse you. And this is really, what is Jesus doing here? Well, what he does in the Sermon on the Mount, it's a formula. He says, you've heard that it was said, and then he quotes something from their scriptures. And then he says, but I say to you, and he says something different. Now what he's doing is he's not throwing away the law of Moses. He's not saying that that's not valid anymore. But what he's saying is, I think what he's saying is, here's what it intended. In other words, here's the direction that it was going. In some places in the Bible, you will see already in the Old Testament where the laws kind of change over time. So for instance, in Leviticus, an earlier book in the Bible, you will see that male slaves could go free after a certain number of years, but there was no concession given to female slaves. Then you read in Deuteronomy, which is a book written a little bit later, and it allows both male and female slaves to be free after a certain number of years. So you can see kind of a direction that these laws are moving in. And I think that what they do is they point towards the time of Christ. And you continue this trajectory, you continue this direction to the day of Jesus. And Jesus says, well, here's what really was intended. The idea of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth was not to just get revenge and have fun doing it, but it was trying to limit what you could do. And the full intent is this: love your enemies. That's why it's so important that when we look at the Bible, we don't look at it as an encyclopedia. We don't read it like a flat book where every part of the scripture has equal weight and equal importance. And I know that sounds really strange, but we all do this. Who here doesn't give the Gospel of John more weight than Leviticus? You know? And we all do this. You can use the Bible to argue for slavery and the abolition of slavery. You can use the Bible to argue for the silence of women in church and for women to preach in church. You can use the Bible to argue for genocide and pacifism. You know, you can use the Bible to argue for just about anything. And so we want to be really careful, because a lot of times what we can do is we can look at an Old Testament text or even a New Testament text, depending on what it is, and you can then argue for a position that is completely opposed to the way of Jesus. And so the thing is, once we realize this, and once we realize that everybody, whether they realize it or not, they kind of choose certain parts of the Bible to emphasize over others, then the question is, how do we do that? How are we going to be guided in how we read the scriptures? And as Christians, I think, of course, the best way that we can be guided to interpret the scriptures is Jesus. Is it in line with Jesus? Does it make sense with what Jesus is teaching? So we want to be careful about how we read the Bible and make sure we don't read it in such a way that somehow we end up supporting something that's opposite of what Jesus taught. So Jesus is teaching, and he says, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Now, this sounds absurd. This sounds absolutely absurd, because when somebody does something wrong to us, we want to get even. Now, we don't necessarily think, oh, I'm going to get my revenge. You know, we don't necessarily think, oh, I'm going to fight them, you know, or anything like that. But we might hold a grudge. We might treat them as subhuman. You know, there might be ways that we get even with them, even if it's subconsciously. But Jesus says not only that we shouldn't seek revenge against somebody, but we should love them. And when he's talking about loving your enemies, he's not just talking about people who annoy you. That's hard enough. He's not talking about people who just disagree with you. He's not talking about people who think differently than you. He's talking about people who wish to hurt and destroy you. Because in Jesus' day, the obvious elephant in the room is Rome, right? And when Jesus is teaching this, he's teaching it to people who all have this in mind. As he says, when somebody asks you to carry their bag a mile, go an extra mile, we all know that term, go the extra mile, which means go above and beyond. Well, in the biblical times, it was not that uncommon that if you were a Jew and met a Roman centurion, a Roman soldier, that he would make you carry his stuff for a mile because it's heavy. And so you wouldn't necessarily be asked to consent to carrying it a mile. You would be told to. Jesus says if that happens, go 2 miles. Well, that's interesting. So basically, Jesus is teaching us to be doormats, huh? That's what it sounds like. It sounds as though he's teaching us to just be used and abused, but here's the thing. His audience consisted of people who were already used and abused. His audience consisted of people who were already hopeless and oftentimes felt that violence was the only answer. These were an oppressed people group, and as I said a couple weeks ago, I have never been a part of an oppressed people group, and as such, I am at a disadvantage for understanding the Scriptures. And that's true for anyone who's not been a part of an oppressed people group, because these are largely writings of the oppressed. And so we have to remember that these are people that have already been used and abused. They've already felt like they've been treated like doormats, and they feel as though they have no hope, and they feel as though, at least some of them feel as though violence is the only answer. And what Jesus is saying is violence is not only not the answer, it's going to get you killed. If you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And so the answer is not violence, and he's teaching them that the answer is actually peaceful resistance. The answer is that when they ask you to go that 1 mile, you go the extra mile. When they hit you on the face, you offer the other cheek, and you shame them in doing so. How many times throughout history have we seen things happen in the world where somebody submitted to whatever cruel act was being done to them, and in some kind of strange way that actually inspires people to make a difference and to change things? How many iconic photos in history do we have of people who are victims of something that has been done to them that then inspires people to change? Jesus is teaching them that the only way they're going to make change in the world is by living the way of love. And indeed, that's what took place. Now, Jesus was crying as he was getting ready to enter Jerusalem on the donkey on Palm Sunday. Why? Partially because he knew they weren't going to follow him. They weren't going to listen to him. And sure enough, in 66 AD, they would lead a violent revolt against Rome. Rome would come in, crush them, destroy Jerusalem, and level the temple, never to be built again. Violence doesn't work. However, as Christians and the church movement grew in the first 3 centuries, what did they do? They loved others. They cared for others. They grew. Their numbers grew. And eventually it became the official religion of Rome. It didn't work by violence. It worked by peaceful resistance. Continued to work, continuing to be faithful, continuing to love, continuing to serve others. And so what does this mean for us today? Well, Jesus still, I think, teaches us the way of nonviolence. Jesus teaches us, and he modeled it in his life, even in the hardest of times when he was going to be arrested by the religious leaders. He would not let his disciples fight for him, even though they possibly could have overpowered them. He allowed them to question him on trial without defending himself. They allowed him to be beaten, and he allowed them to nail him to the cross. And when he's on that cross, of all the last words that he says on the cross, none of them is a curse towards Rome. What in the world is going on? In fact, one of the things that he says is, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Isn't that the most absurd statement that you've ever heard? I mean, they knew what they were doing, right? Even if they didn't know that Jesus was the Son of God, they knew exactly what they were doing. They were nailing a human being to a piece of wood. Was that an empty statement? I have to wonder, was that an empty statement? I mean, Jesus said he and the Father are one. Why in the world would he ask God to forgive them? Did he think that perhaps God did have some mercy for them, or was it an empty statement? We don't know. We do know that after Jesus died, one of the Roman soldiers said, surely this was the Son of God. We don't know what happened to these soldiers. So many extras in these biblical stories that we don't know what happens to them, perhaps, but we know that Jesus offered mercy to them. You see, we don't understand the extent of God's love. We don't understand the extent of God's mercy. Mercy, it just overwhelms us when we think about it. But there's Jesus on the cross. Some people would say a divine doormat. You know, many people today don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah because Messiahs don't die. Messiahs don't give up. Messiahs don't let themselves be killed. Messiahs are victorious. Messiahs have power over others. Messiahs defeat their enemies. That is what people were expecting. And yet, the Christian would say that this was a part of God's plan. That Jesus dying on the cross was a part of his plan, and actually Jesus, in kind of a paradoxical way, was victorious in defeat. One thing we know for sure, Jesus knew what was coming for him. He knew that his life trajectory, the things that he was doing when he was going to Jerusalem, he knew that he was going to have an early death. And he was willing to do it anyway. He was willing to do it to show us the extent of his love and forgiveness. He was willing to do it, and then God the Father vindicated him by raising him from the dead. And even when he was risen from the dead, he didn't use his time to kind of push it in Rome's face. You know, he didn't talk to anyone. I always think, why not talk to Pilate and say, hey, guess what? I'm back. You know? I mean, he didn't do that. He didn't rub it in anyone's noses. He didn't. He talked to the disciples instead, and he started this new movement called the church, in which people were going to be living by peaceful resistance, living the way of Christ, which is the way of love, the way of nonviolence, the way of reconciliation. And they were going to change the world. And yes, the church has been far from perfect. We see that a lot in the news. A lot in the news lately, that the world is far from perfect. And the church is far from perfect. The world is too, but the church is certainly not stainless. And as we look at the church and church history, anytime we get ourselves entangled in the kingdoms of the world so much that we engage in some of these terrible things that we see on the headlines, we know that we're losing our way. But when we engage in the way of love, when we engage in the way of self-sacrifice, when we follow Christ's way of seeking reconciliation, then we're going the right way. You know, I think this has especially pertinent for us today with not only discourse one-on-one with one another, but also as we look on the national level and the global level, as we look at some of the rhetoric that's shared between different groups that disagree with one another. When different groups disagree with one another, that's one thing, but then when we start attacking one another's motives, and we start attacking one another's character, and when we start speaking in rhetoric that it may only be metaphorical, but it seems to encourage violence against one another. And whenever we do that, whether intentionally or not, we're not following the way of Christ. Because we don't want to encourage violence. We don't want to say anything that would lead other people to think that violence is the answer. That's not the way of Christ. Now, I know that the idea of saying that love is the answer sounds really wishy-washy. How do you nail that down, you know? I'm a practical type of person. I want things spelled out. I like it very literal. I like it very black and white. How do you spell out? What does the way of love look like? I think we kind of instinctively know in a way what the way of love looks like. And I know it sounds weird, like how can love save the world? How can love change anything? You know, I don't know all the exact answers to that. What I do know is that the way we've been doing it hasn't been working. I know that hate and division and violence have only left us with more hate and division and violence. We've given hatred a try. Now, let's give love a try. Amen.